Hi, my name is Andree, founder and CEO of Border0, and today I'm excited to talk about the most flexible policy engine in the world, something that we've implemented in the Border0 policy language. Well, why is it so flexible? Well, simply because we can now do an API call to a system that you control, or really any third-party API, and use the result of that API call to make a policy evaluation. And this way, we can now use your data and your custom logic to decide whether a user should have access or not to your resources. Curious what this looks like? Let's dive into a demo. To start off, we'll take a look at what policies in Border0 look like. A quick refresher. In Border0, we have services, also known as sockets, and these are typically internal databases, SSH services, AWS ECS clusters, or internal web services. And you want to make those available without the need for VPNs, but still have a lot of control, like who has access to what. And we can do that using policies, right? And policies allow you to define conditions under which a user should be able to access this resource. So for example, if we edit this and we'll take a quick look, we'll see that a typical policy has three main conditions: who, where, and when. I call those the three W's. So who has everything to do with the user's identity. Since you can integrate with your custom identity provider using OIDC or SAML, you can now say, hey, everyone who authenticates with @border0.com should have access. Similarly with where, this has everything to do with the IP address or the geolocation of that user. So you can specify IP addresses and countries. And then next up you have when, which has everything to do with, from when, between these sets of dates or between this time of day, a user should have access. So that's what a typical base policy looks like. Next up, we'll take a look at what we can do to extend this policy to also take into account your custom data sources and your custom logic. In order to extend your policy to call an external API, we need to add an integration first. We do that by going to Organization Settings, then Integrations, and then we can press New. From here you select the HTTP integration, and that will allow you to add an API endpoint that we can then later on use. I already have one, so we're just going to go there and edit this one. I've called this the Friday rule, and I'm going to use that to enforce no deploy Fridays. So I don't want the users to be able to access our databases or SSH servers on a Friday, except maybe when they're on call. So to do that, first off, this is the endpoint, and we'll take a look at this code, the API endpoint, where I have my own logic. And that's the logic that will determine what day it is and return a bunch of values and return code. I can say what HTTP method should I use to connect to it. We can set some authorization headers, we can set a content type, we can set whatever headers we want. And then finally, we can customize the body that we send to this API endpoint. And what's important to realize here is that we can on the fly inject variables. So in this case, we're injecting the IP address, where the user is coming from, his or her email address, and then finally the protocol. So with this in place, we can now start taking a look at what this code and this URL actually looks like so that we can implement some of our logic there. All right, now let's take a look at some of our code. What I have here is a little Flask app written in Python that implements the /Friday rule logic that we've just talked about. And I'm going to quickly walk through this. By the way, what you're looking at is something called Replit. It's a pretty cool online editor, and the nice thing is that it gives you a public endpoint, so it's really cool to quickly test with. So here is the logic. Everything under /Friday rule is executed here. So let's quickly walk through that. So first off, we do a quick auth request function. So let's take a look at what that auth request looks like. And really what it does is get the authorization header out of the request. It checks if it's not equal to super secret. If it's not equal to super secret, then we set it to we return a 401 and abort. Otherwise, we will continue. So next up, as you remember, we are posting a JSON body to this endpoint. So what happens here is we're parsing that JSON body that we store in data, then we pull out the IP address, and now we know the IP address that the actual user, let's maybe doing an SSH request or database request, is coming from. So based on this IP address, we can now determine the user's time zone. And so I have a little helper function for that. You can see that here. And what really happens here is basically we're doing yet another API endpoint, in this case to public servers, and I'm posting the IP address, and it's returning me all kinds of information, geo-IP and time zone information about that IP address. So that's what we're doing here. And so now I have a bunch of time zone information for that particular IP address. I'm using the datetime Python library to basically get the current day. And the current day is indicated by a number, where 0 is Monday and 4 is Friday, 6 is Saturday, 7 is Sunday, for example. Right? And so basically, based on that number, if the number is 4, then we return a HTTP code 401, otherwise we return 200. So 401 means denied, 200 means everything is okay, you're good to go. You can also see that we return a JSON with the numerical representation of the day as current day. So that's pretty simple. Now let's take a look. Let's basically test that. So here is a little curl that we're going to do to that same API endpoint, the Friday rule endpoint. We set the authorization header, we set the content type. And this is the JSON that we're going to post and that our API endpoint is going to evaluate. And this is the same that the Border0 API would send to this endpoint. So this is the IP address. We have an email address and a protocol. Let's see what happens here. So the good news is it's returning a 200, which means it's good to go. It also means it's not Friday, and you can see that here as well. We're returning a JSON. It says the current day is 3, which makes sense because today is Thursday. So what we've seen here is that we implemented some logic. We've created a simple API. Now this API is obviously very simple, but it could this is where you would implement your logic, and it could be as simple as this, or it could be as advanced as a million lines of code. That's really up to you. But the powerful thing is that from here on out, you can now start calling other endpoints as well, and really basically make any logic you'd like. Okay, next up, we're going to now start modifying our Border0 policy to start using this API endpoint. We are back at our default policy, and I'm going to edit this. And so now we're going to add this new integration, this API validation endpoint. So we're going to scroll to the bottom. I'm going to add an integration of type HTTP, and then I'm going to select the one we just created, so the Friday rule. And now we can set a few filters. The first one is, what should the response code, the HTTP response code from the API be for this integration to be considered true, to successfully evaluate. So in this case, we set it to 200 because we know that the response code should always be 200, except when it's Friday. So that's how we enforce the Friday rule. And potentially, if you want to, you can also do a expression on the returned JSON. So if we wanted to use that, and I'll use that just for demonstrational purposes, here we can say the JSON that is returned has a element called current day, and that should not be equal to 4. And remember, 4 meant that it was a Friday. Now, this is a little bit double up because we know that on a Friday it returned a 401, but I'm just doing this for demo purposes. What is important for you to know is that you can use either only this one, or only the response body expression, or you can use both, right? But you don't need to use both. That's important to know. Okay, so let's update this policy. And we have now added our integration. So remember, we still have the who, the where, the when, but in addition to that, we are also now evaluating our Friday rule integration. Now, to test if that is successful, we can go to the tester here. Remember, it is Thursday here as I'm testing this. So I'll click test, and this should be green. It should be passing. And as you can see, it's indeed passing. We are indeed getting back a 200, and the current day is not 4, which means it's succeeding. Now also, let's test the failure scenario. So I'll click edit, and I'll say, actually, the response code should be, I don't know, let's say 400, for example. So here we're saying, call that API endpoint, make sure that the response code is set to 400, which won't happen because we know it should be a 200. But we can test this because we just want to make sure that that also works. So there we go. And let's see what the tester tells us. It's red, access is denied, and you can see why it's denied. It basically tells me the HTTP response code didn't match the policy. We expected a 400 and we got a 200, right? So this is awesome. we have now successfully extended our policy to also include a testing of our external API endpoint, something that we together just built. The cool part is you can stack multiple integrations. So for example, we can add a multiple here. So let me add another one. For example, you can see I have a whole bunch of different HTTP ones. In this video, we saw how you can extend your Border0 policy to also evaluate data from third-party data sources with your own custom logic. And so this is how we allow users to truly build fine-grained access policies that meet your exact needs. In the video, we looked at a simple API example, so make sure to check that out. It's available on GitHub. Adapt it to your own needs, and we can't wait to hear what you're going to build with this. The policy integration is available for free and premium plans, so give it a try. Let us know what you're building. Let us know if you run into any issues, and above all, have fun. See you next time.